Hello, everybody, and welcome to this session. If you're just joining us now, we're really delighted to have you joining.
Hello, hello. Really great to see you all. I'm looking forward to this session in particular, and all the sessions, but this one in particular.
Beth, if it's possible for us to have this in a gallery view, it'd be great to be able to just see people as they come in.
Sidra, could we check that it's in gallery view?
I think in Zoom, it's up to the individual person.
No, it's possible just to show
gallery.
this screen. We can show this screen.
Or maybe, yeah, maybe as the webinar format, we can't see everyone like the regular meeting, which would be great to see everyone's faces, as well as Jayati and Morena. But I see that there are people saying where they're from in the chat, so that's as good as we can get for now, perhaps.
Yeah, please do say hello in the chat. It's great to have you here. Hi, Tiara. Hi, Isabel. Hi, Helen. Hi, everybody else. Hi, Kathy, Ramon.
It's good to see someone from Indonesia as well, Ara.
Great. Well, while people keep joining, I think we're going to jump in and get this started because we've got a lot of conversation today. So please do keep adding your name and where you're from in the chat. This is a very global conversation, and we're really, really honored by the panelists that we've got joining us today. So we are going to be using the chat all the way through this session, so you're welcome just to leave thoughts and reflections, and we're also using the Q&A box that you can see at the bottom of your screen for actual specific questions if you want to ask. There should be lots. Great to see you continuing to share where you're dialing in from. Okay, so I'm going to jump in and share my screen. Welcome to this session. It's Global Doughnut Days today on the 6th of November. And following on for the next couple of days, but today is the day that we are joining people online, worldwide, talking about putting doughnut economics into action in so many different ways. We've got sessions going on business, on local government, on national government, on well-being frameworks, on communities, on education. And this session, Andrew and I have actually been really looking forward to for a long time. Andrew Fanning, my colleague at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, and I, Kate Rayworth, we've really been looking forward to this conversation because almost every time we present doughnut economics to audiences, we show them the world, the nations of the world through the lens of the doughnut, and people are really struck by the picture that it reveals. So today's conversation is really going to be focused around the image that we see of the world when we look at nations through the lens of doughnut economics. And we've got the most fantastic 4 panelists joining us today: Jayati Ghosh, Morena Hanbury Lemos, Shiji, and Julia Steinberger. We're so honored that they've joined us. We literally thought of our dream team and they all said yes. So we're so glad of everybody who's joining this session because we're looking forward to the insights of this conversation. So let me kick off. Here's the doughnut. It may be familiar. It's one way of drawing a vision for thriving. It calls on us to leave no one in the hole in the middle, falling short on the essentials of life, leave no one falling short on what every person has a claim to. These 12 social dimensions are drawn from the Sustainable Development Goals, which means all the governments in the world have already agreed that every person has a right not to be left in that hole falling short. So meet the needs of all people, but we need to do this collectively within the means of the living planet, respecting the 9 planetary boundaries that Earth system scientists have identified as the critical life supporting systems that make life work on this planet. So the goal is to thrive within the doughnut. But if that's the goal, we know we are very far from this right now, as all of the red in this image shows us. And this is the world at the global scale of the billions of people worldwide who are falling short on the essentials of life. That's all the red in the center. We want to eliminate that red so that nobody is left in that space of shortfall. But we know we need to do it while coming back within planetary boundaries, in which we're in overshoot of now not only just 6, but actually at least 7 of these 9 planetary boundaries. So last century's economic theories would not turn this story around. They weren't designed to solve this. Last century's theorists didn't see this. Last century's government policies were not designed to turn this story around. They weren't designed in light of this, nor were last century's business models or indeed community lifestyles, aspirations. None of them were designed in light of what we see when we see this double whammy of a challenge, shortfall and overshoot. So this is at the global scale. But of course, most policy, most action happens much closer to home. And to see the world through the national lens would be a massive addition. People say, but we know there's huge inequalities in the world. We know that not everybody is responsible for this. So it was, I think, a big breakthrough when Andrew Fanning and Julia Steinberger, both of them on this call, together with other colleagues such as Dan O'Neill, created the national donuts. They downscaled the concept of the donut to 150 nations. And I'm just going to hand to Andrew now at this point to talk a little bit about that project, what we see when we see the world through the lens of the national donuts, and also, of course, some of the caveats of what the data doesn't yet let us see, so that we're all really sure about what it is we are and not able to see when we look at the world through these national donuts. Andrew, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if you can all see me quite yet, but if not, I can be a disembodied voice for a few seconds. There I am. Let me jump right in and start just by explaining what this shows of these 4 countries. And I'll start with India, where you can see that there is a lot of red in the middle of that donut. There's the residents of India, based on the data that we were able to collect, we're falling far short of a minimum social standard, while at the same time, across most of the biophysical industry indicators that we measured, India is still well within fair shares of planetary boundaries, although overshooting in some, particularly around nitrogen and phosphorus, based on the data we could find. Then you have China, partly falling short and already an overshoot as well, similar to what we see with the global picture. Next, we have Brazil, which is doing a little bit better in terms of social performance, at least based on the international standard that we measured, but also at the same time overshooting multiple planetary boundaries, and in particularly, again, showing a very high overshoot around phosphorus and around nitrogen. And then we have the United States, of all the countries shown on the screen, doing the best, once again, based on this international social standard, although you can see a small red dot there is for the indicator around inequality, but just massive levels of overshoot beyond fair shares of planetary boundaries. And I think that these images just provide us with a tool that we can show countries side by side in relation to the types of paradigm of worldview that we want to be showing, or the donut illustrates at the national level. But of course, any empirical study is limited by the availability and the quality of data, and we had our fair share in this study. So we collected data from multiple international data sources. We wanted to include comparable data, of course, and for as many countries as possible. And in practice, in the latest study, we were able to include time series data starting from the early 1990s for 148 countries, all of which have a population larger than 1 million. So a limitation of the analysis is we weren't able to include kind of smaller countries or low population size countries. But it's worth noting that comparing countries, of course, is valuable for situating a given country in a wider context and for seeing them one side along the other. But it does come with a cost that I think is worth noting, that what's lost in such comparisons is, of course, the specificity of any given place, the character of a community that makes each place unique. So when we use metrics that focus on comparing our basic similarities, then we miss the richness of our contextual differences. And I think those can be crucial entry points for actual transformative action. So this global analysis, I always see it as useful because we can see countries side by side. But if we look at any individual nation, it really provides a very blurry image of what matters, especially when we want to create action. So I think of it as a first snapshot that others can use in their own context to dive deeper, and so on. So how do we measure ecological overshoot, the red wedges shooting out, or social shortfall across countries? Ecological overshoot may be less familiar in terms of measurement for some people, so let me start there. We can think of it as being measured by comparing two metrics that track where we want to be, like a target, and how we are doing. So the first metric is an estimate of a country's fair share of planetary boundaries. Now, the planetary boundaries were not designed for smaller scales. It's a global framework, but a range of sharing principles have been applied by researchers to distribute shares of Earth system boundaries to countries. And in this study, we used an equality-based approach, which is based on population size. And with that, we downscaled global boundaries to annual per capita equivalents. For example, the planetary boundary for nitrogen in fertilizer use is 62 million tons per year, which can be converted to an equal per capita boundary. It works out to 7.8 kilograms per person per year for every person on the planet, based on our current population, which is 8 billion people. One exception in this study is for climate change, where we, instead of using an annual metric, we applied an equality-based cumulative approach over time. And that's based on a safe carbon budget, which is associated with historical emissions over from 1850 until 1988, which is the year the safe climate boundary was transgressed. So that's the boundaries. The second metric is a measure of a country's actual ecological performance. And we measure those with consumption-based environmental footprint indicators. And this means that all the ecological indicators shown here, they account for the upstream environmental burdens that arise from producing the goods and services that are consumed in a country, no matter where in the world those burdens take place. And a major benefit, of course, of environmental footprints is that they start to take into account some of the ecological interconnections between countries, particularly through global supply chain, which is a huge step over the past decade that these databases have become available, and it's very useful, although there are, of course, many other interconnections to consider, which I hope that we will get to discussing later. So ecological overshoot is calculated by dividing each environmental footprint by its respective national share of global boundaries, and these ratios allow us to compare very different metrics side by side, and crucially, as we can see, visualize country-specific performance with respect to a shared ecological ceiling in a donut. So social shortfall is measured in a very similar way. I don't need to go into all the detail. We define a target. In this case, it's a minimum social standard. And then we try to measure how a given country is performing with respect to this target. And a key point, as I mentioned already, is that the social foundation targets that we defined in this study represent an international minimum standard. It's not a life of luxury by any means. It's a minimum. Ideally, we wanted social indicators that focus on the worst off within a country. So in this case, we're measuring deprivations as a share of the population who is falling short. So the goal would be 0% deprivation, like in the global donut. But in the case of for as many countries as we are looking, some deprivation-based indicators couldn't be found, some that could be found were the share of a population lacking access to electricity or lacking access to sanitation, for example. But for those that we couldn't include, we included alternative indicators that track average targets and performance, such as countries with a life expectancy of at least 75 years, for example. And this is a step, but it's not as ideal because we don't actually capture that inequality within countries. And we're hoping to update the national donuts in the next version to get closer to that deprivation-based analysis. So once again, social shortfall is calculated as social performance divided by, that minimum social target, which once again allows us to compare and to visualize very different metrics side by side within a shared social foundation. And I want to wrap up by saying these results we're showing, they have been published in a scientific study. I led the development of a website that you can see at the bottom of the screen, goodlife.leeds.ac.uk, that you can explore the visualizations for many, many more countries. And please feel free to raise any questions or any comments in the Q&A box as we go forward. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. So just to pick up there, when these national donuts were first published in 2018, I started integrating into the presentations that I was doing, and I could really see a look of shock, of surprise, of redefining global relations when I was showing these to people from countries that typically think of themselves as advanced or developed, because they would suddenly see they were in massive ecological overshoot. It was really helping to reframe the paradigm of which countries are doing well or not. So let's move from these four, which are really going to be central to the conversation today, thanks to our speakers, to putting them in a scatter plot of over 50 of those 150 nations. So this is an illustration across the spectrum of nations. And the place where every nation should be aiming to be is in that top left-hand corner, in that little green donut, because that's where a nation has risen up to meet the needs of its people. As it meets the needs of its people, it comes up the chart, but to do so within the means of the planet. So it comes back within, and you can see that red overshoot coming back within. So the first we can notice here is there's not a single country for which the metrics are available that is actually already living in the donut. Costa Rica is closer than any other that we can see here. It tells us to catch ourselves next time we hear ourselves or anybody talking about developed countries or advanced nations, because there's not a single country on this scatter plot that really should be calling itself developed or advanced. There's nothing developed about overshooting planetary boundaries. Here are the four countries, again, that we were just looking at: India, China, Brazil, the United States, spread across this spectrum. And then let's recognize, of course, that this scatter plot does not mean that countries are separate. We are profoundly interconnected. I say this as a British woman in the UK, by histories of colonialism, by current and historic military power, corporate power, by the rig of trade and finance rules, by resource extraction through global supply chains, through the current and future impacts of climate and ecological breakdown. So we know that nations are profoundly entangled, one with the other. Now, the pursuit of GDP growth has tended to take countries in this direction, first towards the donut, but then into an overshoot straight past it. And in fact, we can see from a new scatter plot that Andrew recently created, you can see these tails which literally follow the trajectory of individual countries, following exactly that arrow's direction, moving first up towards, but then instead of going into the donut, moving past it. And again, here are the four countries that we're going to hear from today, showing us that pattern. Can we then turn this story around? Is it possible to stop nations from pursuing this historic trajectory straight past that donut sweet spot? Can we turn around? Can low-income nations rise up and meet the needs of all their people without overshooting planetary boundaries to the extent that nations before them have done? This would be an unprecedented path. Can middle-income nations strongly reorient, meeting the needs of their people while already coming back within planetary boundaries? This too is not a historically trodden pathway. Can high-income nations massively reduce that red ecological overshoot of carbon emissions and material throughput, while finally rising to meet the needs of all of their people, because they certainly have the means and resources to do so? And is it possible to do this, or what is required at the scale of a rebalancing in the world? Rebalancing between nations. And for this, we could bring many thoughts. Is that rebalancing about reparations, return of stolen land, the redistribution of wealth or technology, renegotiating trade and finance rules, reshaping the voice in institutional relations and reshaping global power, and many, many other forms of rebalancing that people may feel are necessary? it's this image, right? This map of, could we reorient the world in this direction that brings us here today, that Andrew and I thought we would love to hear from some people, some scholars who we consider leading scholars of socio-ecological analysis in different regions of the world. What does a perspective look like through their scholarship, from their position, inviting their views? And that's why we're so thrilled to have our 4 panelists joining us today and going to speak really each in turn on the perspective of what this looks like, how realistic or how feasible or what is required from different countries if this story is to be turned around. So we're going to hear from Shiji in China, on Jayati Ghosh on India, Morena Hanbury Lemos on Brazil, and Julia Steinberger on the United States. So if I could hand over first to Shiji, who is an associate professor at the School of Economics at Peking University. Would you like to jump in and tell us from your perspective what you see when you think through the lens of China of this trajectory and what it would take to turn it around?
Okay, thank you, Professor Reward. Would you please turn to my slide? Yeah. Okay, thank you. I think, from just the introduction and the slides, we can see that Chinese progress towards a Doughnut economy, I think it's not too bad, but in fact, there is still room for improvement, especially in meeting the needs of all people, and also staying within the means of living planet. So I'd like to, I think China has already made a lot of efforts for this improvement, especially during the past decade. So I'd like to share with everyone some of the efforts China has made and the challenges it's facing in the process of moving toward a doughnut economy. I think, when it comes to control development within safe ecological boundaries and the tipping points, China, I think, can be considered one of the most proactive countries. You should know that China is fairly committed to transitioning toward an ecological civilization. We actually carried a lot of significant strategies, like since 2007, when the first time that China has introduced the concept of ecological civilization at the national strategy level. And even in 2018, China even put building an ecological civilization in its constitution. And by 2021, Chinese leaders proposed the significant initiative of building a community of life for man and nature. China has not only set forth the ambitious goal of transitioning to an ecological civilization at the national strategic level, but has also broken down this grand vision in great detail. To achieve this goal, a series of specific objectives has been established, like just like this slide show, accompanied by targeted systems and policies. So through a range of government regulations, physical and tax systems, and also some market mechanisms, China aims to guide and promote the realization of these goals. In this top-down manner, Chinese government has put forward I think dialectical development theory. We emphasize that ecological protection and the socio-economic development actually are unified. Protecting the ecosystems can better facilitate socio-economic development, and also socio-economic development in turn can better protect the ecosystems. Yeah, I just returned from a survey in a county in the southern part of the of China. Yeah, in that country, the local government has made many valuable attempts to achieve a better development through a better environment. So many of the rural areas in China are not only more, maybe I think sustainable, and also the welfare of the people there has also significantly improved. Okay, maybe next slide, please. Yeah, so we know that China has experienced rapid economic growth in the past 2 decades of the 20th century. In the first decade of 21st century, the Chinese government still placed a strong emphasis on fast economic growth. Well, however, starting from the second decade of the 21st century, the Chinese government changed its attitude toward economic growth. We just try to shift from a high-speed growth to slower growth, with less focus on growth itself and more on how to achieve high-quality development through structural optimization. Okay, next. Yeah, next slide. And I think China has also made considerable efforts in ensuring that everyone lives above a certain social threshold. Yeah, for example, in order to eliminate poverty, the government has made many efforts. Yeah, China has implemented we call it a targeted poverty alleviation strategy during the past years. Just like as this slide show. Yeah, I think this policy actually has yielded very positive results. And in 2021, China declared that we completed task of eliminating extreme poverty. So as we know that China is the home of nearly 1/5 of the world's population. So this, I think, is complete eliminating extreme poverty, I think is actually a milestone in the history of China. And also this is has already made a very important contribution to the cause of global poverty alleviation. Okay, next. But yeah, I think China, although we make a lot of effort and also we can say a lot of outcomes, but China still faces many challenges on the path toward doughnut economy, I think. The first one, I think, just as this slide show, we just transition, China's a top-down approach to promoting the transition to an ecological civilization actually is quite unique. First, as I understand it, no past civilization transition was deliberately driven in a top-down manner. Okay, second, to my knowledge, no other country is currently promoting the transition to an ecological civilization in this way. So from the historical experiences of other countries and the development process, I think many transitions occurred naturally as a structural adjustment when socioeconomic development reached a certain stage. However, China is still a developing country and just an upper middle income nation. While many countries underwent a natural transition, China is transitional before becoming fully wealthy, before it gets rich. So this make China face a lot of development pressure. For example, we still face many difficulties, such as our per capita carbon emission continue to rise. And we also have serious social inequality issues. I think all this require us to make strenuous efforts. Maybe I just like to say, yeah, during the past decades, Chinese government has made effort to make sure a safe and fair space for everyone. But because China is still in the developing stage, so we still facing a lot of challenge. We still need a lot of efforts. Okay, yeah, thank you.
Gee, thank you so much. That was quite fascinating. It's triggered in me a lot of questions, and I bet lots of other people are having questions. So please, if questions are arising for you, please do put them in the Q&A section so that we can come back to them later. Yeah. But that was really fascinating. So going to keep moving. We are going to go to the question of India, to Jayati Ghosh, who is Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst at the moment, but was also Professor of Economics in India for many, many years, and will speak to us of the story that she sees and the context of India. Please, Jayati, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kate, and it's really a privilege to be part of this very fascinating conversation. And thank you also for these really incredible and very telling slides, which I think should be seen by everybody on the planet, actually. So I'm going to raise the issue of what a whole lot of the global majority countries are facing, which is, do we develop, do we make our people all achieve a minimum level of development, or do we try and keep within planetary boundaries, restrict climate change, et cetera, And unfortunately, it is always presented as an either or kind of a discussion. In my own country, in India, it is dominant. I mean, you know, our prime minister will say, we have to develop, we have all these poor people, we have, and we cannot afford to do the kinds of things that we are being asked to do. So I want to emphasize how much I think this donut approach can contribute to that discussion, because that's simply not true, that we have to do it that way. So let's begin first with, you know, you saw it earlier, India is way behind on most of the essential sustainable development indicators that will enable a meaningful, decent, dignified life for all of our people, okay? We have lots, I think now it's really about 100, it's about 1 billion poor people, yeah? We have upwards of 1.4 billion people, the largest country on the planet, but about 1 billion of them would be considered poor in any other country of the world. And we also have the largest number of hungry people in the world. And extraordinarily, the number of hungry has actually increased rather than decreased if you go by some of the basic nutrition indicators. Around 74% of our population cannot afford the FAO's minimal nutritious diet. Okay, so it's really bad news in that sense. And of course, we have about 30% of people who still don't have access to electricity. Lots of issues out there. So the argument typically is that we in India cannot afford to do the kinds of things that are required, the environmentally necessary things that are required. And what the donut does is actually show you that that's not true. That in fact, we can do that. And we can do that because of the fact that we can develop in a different way. We can grow in a different way. We can choose a development trajectory that avoids the mistakes of the past and also of the present, the ones that we're currently on, in two major ways, okay? And the first is that we have to stop looking at just GDP growth in itself as the goal. I think Kate has enumerated this. Everybody, I'm sure pretty much everybody here recognizes that GDP is a terrible indicator, including a lot of bad stuff, excluding a lot of bad stuff. But, you know, India is really the classic example of a country where GDP growth has been very impressive and solid for about 2 decades now, if you look at the aggregate. And yet the living conditions of the vast majority of people have not really improved. And if you look especially at the bottom half of the population, you find nutrition indicators have worsened, life expectancy has improved, yes, but maternal mortality has not improved very much. We have some of the worst nutrition indicators. If you look at some states of in our country, they are worse than any of the most you know, depressed South African, sub-Saharan African countries. What the real wage has barely increased now for 15 years. The median real wage has actually declined. So we are seeing a country in which there is all this monetary aggregate GDP growth, and yet people's living conditions have not improved. In fact, in many cases, they have become more fragile, more insecure, more, in a way, deadly, because not only are you facing pandemics, but you're facing already the impacts of climate change and the erosion of the ecology, which comes back to affect your cultivation, your ability to access natural resources, all kinds of things like that. Why is this? And that's because of really one of the other things in which India has fallen so far behind. It's because of inequality. So I want to emphasize that when we're thinking about the donut, we have to put inequality front and center of this. It's not just inequality between countries, which is very evident, as you can see from this excellent graph here, but it's inequality within countries. The top 10% of our population has got per capita carbon emissions, which is a good proxy for all of the other ecological damage that we do, which are equivalent to the average in Europe. The top 0.1%, that's the very, very rich in India, have got carbon emission, per capita carbon emission levels of the top 10% anywhere in the world. In other words, it is, and the top 10% of our population are responsible for about 60% of our carbon emissions. And as I said, these are a proxy for all of the other ecological damage, all the other planetary boundaries that we exceed. So really, inequality is the key. And we can keep within this donut if we address inequality. We can provide a better life for all, keeping within that donut, if we actively engage in reducing inequality and in a variety of ways, in looking at pre-distribution, as it's called. What is it that has prevented real wages from increasing? How do we increase employment, good quality employment for all men and women of working age? How do we improve their access to health, education, basic social services, sanitation, housing, etc., which, many of them are still lacking altogether. How do we do that sustainably? Of course, by taxing the rich, which is a critical part of our thing, which we do not do enough. By taxing the large corporations, especially the multinational corporations that are getting away with paying almost no tax in India and in pretty much every other country. And by addressing the pre-distribution in terms of the regulatory processes that allow big corporations and the rich to grab land, to grab other aspects of nature, to exploit people, to exploit segmented labor markets in different ways, to exploit the social differences between men and women, between different castes, between different ethnic groups, in a way that they would maximize their own surpluses and returns. This can be done. It has been done in a bunch of other countries, and it's been done even in countries with lower per capita income. So it is really generating that political momentum to reduce the inequality that would enable us to keep within that donut. And I emphasize it can be done. It requires a different kind of politics, but we've now seen that we need that different kind of politics everywhere. And if we are to fight the right-wing impulses that are emerging across the world, because everyone is angry at the very insecure lives that they are being dealt with in the current phase of global capitalism. If we are to fight those, we have to address that political impulse. Thanks very much.
Jayati, thank you. Very powerful. Big conversation today. Thank you so much. I'm going to take us straight on to Brazil and invite Morena Hanbury Lemos to share. She's a doctoral candidate in ecological economics at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, but of Brazil originally. And we're really delighted, Morena, to hear your contribution following Jayati. Please do take the floor.
Thank you, Kate and Andrew, for the invitation, and thank you, Jayati and Shi, for the very inspiring presentations. I wish I had a presentation that would be as positive as Shi's, but I think I will go more onto like Jayati's tone, I guess, because the situation in Brazil is sadly not as positive as the situation in China. But for my 7 minutes, I want to highlight 3 points that come to mind when I look at Brazil's donuts. And the first one is, if you play around with the website that Andrew showed in the beginning, and I really invite you all to go there and play around with the different iterations of the donut. If you look at the national trends for Brazil, the indicators that have worsened the most since 92 are phosphorus, nitrogen, and material footprint. So if we're thinking about the ecological ceiling, these are the ones that have, I guess, pushed Brazil towards this side of the graph that we see on the screen the most. But if we take a minute to think about material footprint and connect with the minor improvements that happen in the indicator of equality from 92 to 2015, we will see that actually this material improvement or this increase in material consumption has been grabbed by an elite in the country, right? So that it hasn't been necessarily distributed or allocated to the population that needs an increase in material consumption the most. So I think, you know, looking at the different indicators of the donut and trying to connect them can actually help us tell a more complete story. And there has been quite a lot of research recently on the material and the energy requirements for what we call a decent living, I think. And we actually see some results from this type of research showing that if we think about improving the living conditions of the most vulnerable population, it's actually not that material intensive. It wouldn't increase so much the material footprint of countries to lift, I guess, the populations, the most vulnerable populations out of poverty. What is very material intensive is overconsumption that is driven by capital accumulation. So that's the first point that I wanted to make, looking at the change from 92 to 2015. And then if you can move to the next slide, Kate, please. Another point that I always like to think about when I think of the donuts, and I have worked with the donuts before, and when I was working with it, I would always say that the donuts are not floating in space. And I feel like that helps me to always think about the interconnectedness of the donuts, right? And even if the national donuts do not necessarily capture that interconnectedness, they do help us to think about it when we see them played around in the graph that Kate just showed us. We can think, if we could see like an animated version of that graph, they would probably kind of push each other around. So one donut going towards the right would probably mean pushing another donut towards, I guess, down. So if you can think one donut, material conditions or ecological ceiling being pushed outside of the limits would also mean possibly making the social conditions of another donut worse. So if we think how, you know, development and underdevelopment are really connected, they are not separate. And in many cases, the development of one country can mean the underdevelopment of another country, right? So if we think about the two worst indicators in the case of Brazil, that are phosphorus and nitrogen, because I am a little bit of a data freak, I went to look a bit more into this data to get a bit more information. And this is, again, something that I find very inspiring about the donut, because you get a snapshot of some data, and then if you're like, oh, actually, I want to look into this information a bit more, then you can zoom in and find more information about what you're looking at. So I looked at some data for the phosphorus and nitrogen footprint of Brazil, but also about the territorial use of nitrogen and phosphorus for Brazil. And what I found interesting about this is that it gives us an understanding of how the Brazilian economy is kind of organized. So Brazilian consumption of phosphorus from the rest of the world, so that is not used within the Brazilian national borders, is in 2015. So I tried to match the same year, even though I used a different database. So the data is not comparable, but I tried to match the same year. It was of 134 million kilograms of phosphorus. But Brazilian consumption of phosphorus used within national borders was of 3 billion kilograms. So we can see that the final demand of Brazil's use of phosphorus is mostly met by national use of phosphorus, right, within Brazilian borders. But then what is interesting is if we think about how much the rest of the world consumes of phosphorus that is used in Brazil, this number goes up to 32 billion kilograms in 2015. And for me, what this shows us is actually that this system that uses a lot of phosphorus, which is very much connected to the agribusiness in Brazil, actually doesn't necessarily serve us, just the Brazilian economy, but it serves the world economy in a way. And obviously, we can't really see this 32 billion number in the Brazilian national donuts because it's diluted in the other donuts. And that's what I mean about this interconnectedness. That is interesting when we try to look into it. And then a similar situation happens to nitrogen. So Brazil's consumption of nitrogen from the rest of the world is 223 million kilograms in 2015. Brazil's consumption from its own borders is 1.4 billion. And then how much the rest of the world consumes is 64 billion, which is a very outstanding number. And for me, what this shows us is exactly this connection between, an economy that is not necessarily focused on improving the living conditions of its own population, but it's also focusing on the global capital. And how, if we look at can you show the slide before again, Kate, quickly? Yeah. If we look at how, this trajectory that Brazil is going is really, really bad because it's going to the right without even going up that much. And you can see how it's following the trajectory of other countries like the US and Australia and Canada. So it's really a model of development that doesn't really work, that pushes us outside of the ecological ceiling without really helping us to achieve the social conditions that we want. And then quickly looking back at the next slide, Kate, please. Yes. The last point that I want to make is about the interconnectedness within the donuts. So if we think again about the relationship between the ecological ceiling, so the biophysical indicators, but also the social indicators. And I will bring to the same topic that Jayati wanted to highlight, which was inequality, right? So if we think about the same system that uses a lot of phosphorus, that uses a lot of nitrogen, which is the agribusiness in Brazil, right? Is very much based on monoculture. That is a system focused on, or that uses a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus. It's very intensive. This same system also promotes land concentration. So it's also connected to how the social indicator for inequality is not improving over the years as much as we would like it to improve. And not only that, but it's related to natural or not natural, man-made disasters. I refuse to call them natural disasters because they're not natural at all. And we had a very horrible case in the last few months that we are still dealing with in Rio Grande do Sul in the south of Brazil, where we had floods, very intense floods that were also caused by how land was changed around the river basin of Rio Grande do Sul, and it was changed also by the agribusiness. So it's a compound effect of the same system that affects the phosphorus and the nitrogen consumption or the footprint. It affects inequality, and it also affects how we are vulnerable to the disasters that come with the change in the climate. I guess these are the 3 points that I wanted to highlight.
Thank you so much, Morena. And fascinating to hear you talking about the animations that you want to make visible. For me, this scatter plot is a sort of starting point of like, what else could we make visible? How else could we enhance this and use data to make other patterns visible? And again, I invite anyone to post a suggestion or a wish in the chat. If only we could see this, if only we could see that. How can we make this more and more visible to bring out the realities that our panelists are speaking to today? Thank you so much. I'm going to turn to Julia Steinberger to talk about the perspective of the United States in this picture. So Julia is Professor of Ecological Economics at the University of Lausanne and a US citizen. And we're really thrilled, again, to have you joining us, Julia. Please do take the floor.
Thanks so much. And I guess just to explain why I'm doing the US. So I'm a US citizen, even though I am also a Swiss citizen and living and working in Switzerland and haven't been back to the US in quite a while at this point. I guess I should also address the elephant in the room. The US has reelected Trump. The whole world will suffer the consequences of this. So that's just something that happened today that I think should be acknowledged, and maybe people will have more questions or wanting to discuss that in different ways. And I think that it's also very important that when we're doing this kind of research and discussing these countries, we have to stay critical of our governments. It doesn't matter who's in government. It doesn't matter if they're doing some things right, or even most things right. Our role as researchers really always has to be critical and thinking about how these things could be improved and who is paying the price for them, who is suffering from inequality, deprivation, and potentially overseas harm as well. So the first thing I want to do just in this little snippet is come up with some historical explanation as to why the heck the US, Canada, and Australia are sitting out there. Morena was saying that Brazil is on its way to join them. There's still a bit of distance. One of the things that the countries in the high resource part of the plot have in common is they generally are low population density, and high extractive resource availability countries. And there's two reasons for countries to end up in that area. One is that like the US, Canada, and Australia, they're colonies. So descendants of empires, of European empires, effectively. In this case, all three of them are from the English Empire, although they also had contributions from the French in the case of Canada and the US. And these colonies did a couple of things. One, the first thing they did is they committed genocide. So they basically emptied the existing territories of their indigenous populations. And the indigenous populations were also ones that had sort of managed the ecosystems in more durable ways in both the North American case and the Australian case. And that knowledge is in great part destroyed and lost. And that's something that we should also be thinking about. The other thing that they did is they basically had these territories where the resources hadn't been used yet. So the European core was not only higher population density, it also had used up a lot of its mines in terms of metal. A lot of the extraction had already happened. And in the US, Canada, and Australia, there's all these resources that become available, and they're used in very extremely wasteful ways, including especially in the development of urbanization. So what happens in the US, Canada, and Australia is you have cities that are developed after the age of the automobile in great part, and the development of very car-dependent suburban urban settlements and long-distance travel that's based on private motor transport rather than rail, for instance. So that the infrastructure that's put into place or that is preferred throughout the century ends up being the car infrastructure, and that accounts for a lot of this resource use. I guess something else I should say about these countries and the US in general is that it's extremely unequal. So you have large wealth inequality, and wealth inequality goes with resource use inequality. And part of the research that I've been doing in the Living Well Within Limits project, we looked into that inequality worldwide and within countries. And what we found pretty much universally is that inequality manifests itself in the transport sector. So the wealthier people are all over the world, the more they use transportation. And in this case of the US, Canada, and Australia, that's cars, big cars, long distances. You can see Sweden and Norway up there as well. They do a lot of flying as well, interestingly, within their countries. And I think that's also the case in Brazil, rich people who can't afford to just fly around because that's the way that they choose to travel. Okay, so that's one thing, is the inequality and what that leads to in terms of resource use. It also leads to a lot of deprivation within the country. So the US is unequal. And I think that the outcome of today's result in terms of the presidential election, a lot of the results I'm seeing, the news I'm seeing, shows that economic discontent with rising prices and inequality and economic insecurity more generally, is what led a lot of Americans, regardless of their other convictions or ethnic origin or any other things, to shift the vote towards Trump compared to the last election. The other point that I think is really important to keep in mind when we're talking about the industrial core, these are countries that import a lot of resources in general. So the United States, Canada, and Australia are exporters of some things, but importers of other. And that means that their import-related, consumption-related emissions and environmental impacts are generally larger than their production ones. This is certainly true for a lot of European countries that are also on the sort of wealthier side of things. And the impacts of that in terms of environmental degradation in the communities that face extraction and in the communities that face environmental devastation tend to be elsewhere than in those countries. So I think that there's also a sort of global interconnection to think of when we see this slide. It's not just that the United States is wealthy and consuming a lot, and we see that that's not disconnected from the poverty and deprivation seen in other parts of the plot. And I would put certainly other European countries in that context as well. Our wealth should not be disconnected from deprivation elsewhere. Our use of resources should not be disconnected from environmental impacts elsewhere. So I think that all of these aspects of the interconnections are really important. Maybe I should just end by saying that we've done some modeling, again, as part of the Living Well Within Limits project, which is now continuing in the REAL project that Morena is also part of. And we kind of know how many resources are necessary for the high well-being within planetary boundaries. And the determinants of well-being are in fact not wealth or high income, they are human need satisfaction. These needs can be satisfied at relatively low resource use, but it requires a lot of equality. And I think one of the aspects that Shiji was speaking about was the reduction of poverty in China. Reduction of poverty is one thing that's entirely compatible with living, with remaining within planetary boundaries. But what's not compatible with remaining within planetary boundaries is inefficient reduction of poverty, which is basically based on current infrastructures and technologies. We have to do a lot better than that. We have to go towards really investing in really efficient infrastructures and technologies for poverty alleviation, whether it's housing, transportation, or food. This is absolutely essential. The other point is we have to reduce overconsumption. So that means that whether it's in the US or in China or in India or in Brazil or wherever else on the planet, excess wealth is just not something that is compatible with being in the donut. And excess consumption, excess production is just not something that we can possibly afford if we want to survive the next century with decent chances. And I think that that's something that has to be taken a lot more seriously as well. And I'll finish there.
Julia, thank you so much. Really fascinating big picture. Thank you. In fact, thank you all of you. It's very full, the perspectives that you've brought. So I know that there are lots of questions that people are raising. And again, if this is raising questions for you, please put them now in the Q&A and we will pick them up. And I'm just going to turn to Andrew to say, do you want to pull some of the questions out of the Q&A that are rising for people? We've got about just under 20 minutes left together, everybody. So Andrew, go ahead.
Great, sure. And I've already seen we probably have more questions than we'll be able to get through. But looking at the Q&A, that's one that I guess drawing directly from the intervention by Julia, and thanks to all the speakers as well, of course, is asking how you feel about any nuggets of hope for donut economics in light of today's election result in the United States.
Okay, should I try to take that one? Or does
Yeah,
anybody else?
that would be great.
I feel zero hope. Okay, so I don't feel hope. I think there's work to do. I think that one of the aspects we really need to understand is, I think the economic aspect is really huge. And we have to be building absolutely fundamentally different economic perspectives into whatever alternative politics we put forward. And I think that when all is done and dusted, the fact that the Democrats didn't acknowledge the economic pain that a lot of the country was in, and sort of assumed that messaging would help rather than reality on the ground. I think that our politics has to be laser focused on the inside of the donut, which is universal, affordable access to basic needs satisfaction. You can think about it as the SDGs if you want. You can think about it as needs from the human needs perspective, which is a perspective that I like. But that is the thing we have to focus on. If we focus on that, we have a chance. If we fail on that, we have zero chance. And I think that that's a very different politics than what we're seeing today in a lot of places around the world. And this is unpublished stuff, but we have this really exciting paper that's in review right now, one of the new results from the REAL project, where we really see that subjective well-being indicators are dependent more, much more, with much better outcomes on human needs satisfaction than on economic growth. And I think that that's something that our even politics, most politics on the left of center is refusing to think about seriously.
That's great. I mean, I'm fully on board and I look forward to reading that in detail. It reminds me of one of the findings from our paper together as well, that very much showed that very similar, the more basic needs that a country or that are satisfied by a country, the higher the levels of subjective well-being and as well as the levels of life expectancy. So really great to hear that deepening of that finding, which we didn't get a chance to do. It's just supplementary figure. Wonderful. So let me move to some, and I should have mentioned that question was from Helen John, the previous one. Let me dive in a question from Xiaoting Hugh Jones, who is our colleague, of course, at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, and she's asking Shiji, any suggestions and thoughts on how China can manage those development tensions that you mentioned and others mentioned above? So, for example, inequality, youth unemployment within China, increasing material footprints, and other tensions in order to get into the safe and just space for humanity. Thanks.
Well, okay. Yeah. I think as I show in my slides, although China still faces serious inequality issues, according to the Gini coefficient, we have already passed the most serious threshold. Yeah, just as I show in the slide, according to the Gini coefficient, we actually have already passed the turning point. Yeah, so it is shown that we are moving toward a more equitable development. I believe this is a good news, but yeah, but our Gini coefficient is still quite high. Yeah, I think it is indeed a problem. It just as Professor Daly once suggested, globally developed countries should cede some developed space to developing countries. And I think China itself also faces significant regional development imbalances. For example, in developed cities and regions like Beijing and Shanghai and also Guangzhou, our research shows that the growth in these areas has already decoupled from welfare growth. Yeah, that indicates that that means that the GDP growth in those regions no longer necessarily leads to improvements in welfare. Therefore, I think for these regions, the focus should shift from ecological growth to structural optimization and more high quality development maybe. And the growth space should be ceded to developing and undeveloped regions, particularly the Western regions. In the Western regions, economic growth and welfare growth are still positively correlated, as shown in our research. This means that this area still need room for growth, but it is essential to adhere to a more sustainable growth model, I think. Yeah, that's my my answer to this question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I saw some questions that were particularly focused that on China's CO2 emissions as shown in the national donuts that I thought that I could pick up a little bit just to raise here. The key difference, well, there's a couple points that are worth noting. All of the indicators except for the carbon emissions, the climate change dimension, are annual measures. So they look at the level of ecological pressure or pollution or resource use per year. Whereas, and in our original National Donuts approach, we also looked at an annual approach. We said, okay, if we look at 2-degree boundary was our original approach, which in 2015, we didn't know how catastrophic 2 degrees actually apparently could be. And so we said, all right, let's look at 2 degrees. If we take a downscaling at a per capita level, let's say 1.6 tons per person per year could be annual per capita boundary. And of course, currently China's consumption-based carbon emissions are somewhere in annual terms around just over 7 tons, similar to the EU. So far, far, far above the 1.6 ton annual per capita boundary. For this latter report that we published in 2022, we really heard from, in particular, low-income and emerging economies that this approach was effectively, it forgives a massive responsibility for climate breakdown that has overwhelmingly been driven by the countries of the global north. And so we recognize that there was data available for climate change emissions that go all the way back to 1850, that we could take a cumulative approach, recognizing that emissions build up in the atmosphere, and that's what's causing climate change. So we adapted the climate change indicator to be a cumulative metric, whereas all the others are annual basis. And when you do that, you see that in China, they're growing very rapidly. Actually, since these results have been published, China has now arguably overstepped the 350 parts per million fair share and are now in a period of overshoot due to the increasing growth that emissions are moving. However, you will see that it's not, 4 times beyond the boundary, because over that extended period of time, China has emitted far less emissions than other high-income nations, as we can see in the United States. I hope that helps to clarify some of the differences there in terms of annual versus cumulative and what we showed. And I also see another question from just the latest one that came in that I think is a great one for the $1 million question, almost, from Auguste Cruzet at TU Delft, who asks, how do we make the sufficiency transition of overconsumption desirable in our worldwide system that is driven by capitalist consumption? How do we make the donut economy more desirable than the existing system that is based on infinite growth? And I will just leave that for whichever speaker would like to give it a shot.
Okay, I'm willing to have a go, also because I have to leave soon. So this is a chance for me to say everything I want to say about various things that have come up. So, very, very starkly, it's not possible under capitalism, at least of the kind that we have today. Does that mean we have to forget it and all go home and wait for the end? No, because even in the past, we have been able to regulate capitalism, to force it into constraints that are not necessarily to its liking, but are socially relevant. I think also we have to remember that it is supposedly desirable, this endless consumption, etc. And it is certainly something that the top, the elites and upper middle classes in all of our societies are aiming for. But most of the world is not experiencing. And I think we have to emphasize that. In other words, the reality, the economic reality of most of the world is more insecurity, more inequality, more uncertainty about the future, more struggling for day-to-day things. And that's not desirable. That's not something they want. I think the critical thing really today is to actually have public policies that in the middle of the donut that Julia was talking about, that in the middle of the donut ensure more security, more access to the basics. And I noticed a question in the Q&A about how, you know, the USA seems to be doing pretty well on that inner part of the donut. So how do you explain something like Trump? And the answer is this, is that in fact, yes, it's doing pretty well if you compare with the rest of the world. There's no question that every, you know, US citizen, no one is going to starve to death in the US as such, and, you know, all of that. They might die from an opioid. They might have a, you know, a death of despair. They might have other kinds of issues. But in fact, there are these massive levels of insecurity, of hopelessness because of a general failure to provide a decent life. And that doesn't necessarily always require continuous consumption. It requires a basic stability, a security, a resilience in the face of shocks, and some degrees of social protection. Without that, you're not going to get social cohesion. You're going to get all these divisive political tendencies. We see them in all our countries in different levels. My own country, I mean, I guess we now have to give lessons to people in the US how to cope with fascism, because you do have to learn to cope with fascism in these circumstances. But what it means, therefore, is that, yeah, we won't be able to get the ideal donut under capitalism, but we can certainly move towards it even under capitalism through regulation, through different kinds of state intervention, through policies that make sure that we provide that minimum security, resilience, social protection, etc., through things that reduce inequality in the ways that we were talking about. And there I also want to mention the global context, and I noticed there were a couple of questions on that. So I just want to very quickly pick up on both. One is about finance and how many more countries are turning to gold as in reserves. That's not simply because suddenly there's a hunger for gold. It's because the US was incredibly foolish, I believe, in imposing sanctions and freezing reserves of other countries because they decided they didn't like them for whatever reason. They've done it to Venezuela, to Syria, to Libya, etc. But they also did it to Russia, which made every other country sit up and say, oh, it can happen to any of us. And so let us actually think of alternative methods of holding reserves. Let us think of alternative ways of transacting other than in the US dollar. Let us think of other ways of pricing our trade. And that is happening. It's a slow process, but it is happening. It's moving in that direction. I don't think it's all bad. I think dollar hegemony was bad for the US and terrible for the rest of the world. So I don't think that's a bad tendency. Does it mean that it's not that countries are basing their currencies in gold? No one does that anymore. But it is that they're holding different kinds of reserves. But also we do have to regulate finance globally, not just nationally. We have to regulate finance. It has been done before. We can do it again. We cannot allow finance, especially short-term, profit-oriented, highly commercialized, but impersonalized finance, to dictate the direction of our investments, because that's really what is driving us over that precipice, way beyond our planetary boundaries. And also other global trade rules, especially the trade rules that have reduced employment in so many countries. Everyone talks about the US as if the US has lost jobs, but you know, India has lost manufacturing jobs. Brazil has lost manufacturing jobs. Many, many countries have lost manufacturing jobs. And not just manufacturing, they have lost the possibility of diversification, which was so critically important. And one major reason for the inability to do the transition, the thing that Morena highlighted, that we have to do the transition in a decent way. In other words, we have to reduce poverty not using the same old formula. We have the technologies that will allow us to do that. These technologies are held by major companies largely based in the US and China, and they are not shared. We have to share those technologies. We have to enable the dissemination of technologies. We have to get rid of intellectual property rules that privatize and concentrate knowledge. And so those rules, global rules, have to be changed. That doesn't mean an end to capitalism, but it is certainly a significant reform of the capitalism we have. And the capitalism we have is not going to allow us to get to the donut anywhere. So clearly, we have to make those changes before we get to approaching that donut.
Thank you so much, Jayati. That's Wonderful, wonderful wisdom that I appreciate for sharing. We're getting close to the end. I would like to invite Morena, if you have any final comments that you would like to add to the mix, then please.
Yeah, maybe I can say just a couple words. I don't want to take too much time on this. I guess it was the last question, but now there is a new one by August on how we make this transition desirable, I guess. And I think when I think about the question of desirability, it really makes me think about how capitalism is so inefficient at delivering what we need. And this is really something that we can see when we look at the donuts, because we see how much it costs ecologically for a little bit of improvement in the social foundation. And I think if this type of narrative can't help us share how desirable something else is, because capitalism is extremely inefficient at getting us to where we're trying to get. And there needs to be another way that I think personally is very much connected to what Julia shared, something that will materially change the living conditions of the population, which is something that capitalism is not doing. And it's making the population even go towards, fascism in many countries. It happened in Brazil, it happened in the US and in China. In Brazil now, we managed to get rid of our local fascists for now. But at the same time, this is very much connected to the fact that the government now managed to improve the living conditions of the population. And that is what is kind of like holding things up so that the fascists won't come back later in the next election that we have actually very soon. But at the same time, it's all very sensitive within capitalism. It's all almost ready to fall at any time because it's inefficient in delivering that. And I think if we can show this inefficiency, and if we can show how much it's costing us also ecologically to achieve so little, and show that we have other alternatives, as Julia was mentioning, there are other ways of delivering people with, decent living conditions that are not being, so devastating for the environment, also for the population. So I guess this is my little sense of hope in regards to this question, and I would end with that.
Thank you so much. I think that's just the right balance of ending, just acknowledging the realities that we're facing, while at the same time just seeing how much we can already do and that we know can be done. Just need to figure out how to get there. So thanks for that. I'm going to pass the final word to Kate. Put you on the spot for the last. We're 2 minutes late.
I'm just going to say
please.
a huge thank you to everybody. What fascinating and really powerful contributions. And amazing comments and questions that are coming in the chat just shows how much this conversation wants to keep happening and how much we could keep talking a lot longer and go a lot deeper. But I'm thrilled to see that this scatter plot of the national donuts that Andrew, Julia, and others initiated, and we now use in almost every single presentation. It enables us to see things differently, to have this conversation. Again, if people have ideas for what else do you wish it could help make visible that enriches this conversation, please keep sharing us. But I want to thank everybody for joining, all the participants, all the questions, but particularly for our panelists, Julia, Jayati, She, and Morena. Thank you so much for your work, for your analysis, for your scholar and your activism that is so important. Please, let's keep researching and taking these messages. And as Julia says, we need to transform the politics and connect scholarship with activism, with politics to start turning this story around. Thank you, Andrew, too, for this analysis. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us.
The language interpreters who were also able to join us a little bit later. Thanks for that, too.
Thank you all. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.